The fourth principle of Unitarian Universalism is a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Our opening words are taken from a reflection on that fourth principle by Reverend Paige Getty from the UU Congregation of Columbia, Maryland. As responsible religious seekers, we recognize that we are privileged to be free, to have resources to pursue life beyond mere survival, to continually search for truth and meaning, to exist beyond bonds of dogma and oppression, and to wrestle freely with truth and meaning as they evolve. This privilege calls us not to be isolated and self-centered, believing that our single perspective trumps all others, but rather to be humble, to be open to the great mysteries of truth and meaning that life offers. And those mysteries may speak to us through our own intuition and experience, but also through tradition, community, conflict, nature, and relationships. As a faith tradition, Unitarian Universalism makes sacred the right and responsibility to engage in this free and responsible quest as an act of religious devotion. Institutionally, we have left open the questions of what truth and meaning are, acknowledging that mindful people will, in every age, discover new insights. And last week, Reverend C.W. Dawson also spoke about truth. He said that truth is not true because it comes from a particular book. It is true when it is in alignment with what is real in the world. Today, we will have the opportunity to think further about how truth relates to our present world and what it means to us personally. And we will also have the opportunity to sing together this morning, starting with hymn number 403, Spirit of Truth, of Life, of Power. You may now wish to light a candle at home or look in the chat window for a digital chalice. As we light our chalices, the symbol of our faith, at home or digitally, will you please join me in lifting your voices in homes across our city, country, and world to share our weekly words of affirmation. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another.
Good morning, everyone. I'm the Reverend Molly Hausch-Gordon, the minister of this congregation, and I am so grateful to play a small role in today's wonderful lay-led service series by sharing with you a centering moment and our sharing of joys and sorrows. Our centering moment this morning will be a meditation on Seeking the True Questions by the Reverend Linda Hansen. So let us now enter into a moment of contemplation. Much of our human struggle is with what we do not know or understand. It's difficult not to need answers once and for all. And it's even more difficult not to think we already have the answers. And yet that is our work. May we experience what we do not know, not as an individual failure, but as an invitation to community. May we seek not the true answers so much as the true questions, knowing that true questions make our lives meaningful, even if sometimes restless in our journeying. May we indeed be grateful for the restless voices, the challenging questions in our communities. And may we now take just a few moments of silence to listen for the restless voices and the truest questions within ourselves. May we be good company to one another in our questions and on our journey. And as a community that is perpetually seeking truth and making meaning together, a deep part of that work is holding together the profound breadth of human experience, those heights of joy, those depths of sorrow, every landscape in between, every yearning and longing and prayer. Part of what makes us a community of seeking truth and making meaning is our growing capacity, our exercise of the spiritual muscle to hold all of those things together at once, all of the breadth of our lives. And so it is each week that we share the joys and sorrows and prayers of our community, that we hold them tenderly, that we experience that in those things we are not alone, but accompanied on the journey by beloved travel partners. So I will now share joy and sorrow from our submissions, and then we'll invite you in just a moment to type your joys and sorrows into the chat so that we may hold them together. I will read as many aloud as I am able. But first, let us join our hearts in exceeding great joy with the Otten family, who welcomed baby Maggie into the world on Monday, July 20th. Bright blessings to the whole family, and particularly to Chelsea as she recovers, and to baby Maggie as she grows and we hope continues to thrive. Let us also join our hearts in lament with all of those who do not have access to the human right of health care, particularly in these pandemic times. And let us join our hearts in a prayer of hope for the expansion of Missouri Medicaid on Tuesday to close the coverage gap through which people slip and which we know to be a moral failure of our state. We pray that the vote on Amendment 2 on Tuesday will be a joyful culmination of more than 8 years of work with local advocates fighting for the dignity of our fellow Missourians and for their access to the care that we know they deserve. I will now join in sharing those joys and sorrows that are submitted in our chat. We join our hearts with Dottie, who shares gratitude that another asylum-seeking family has been reunited and out of detention this week. Mom, dad, and 1-month-old baby are headed to the care of a sister congregation in Colorado. May they find freedom and true solidarity in this country. May it be so. We join our hearts with Martha, who shares her congratulations to the Otten family, and many others of us who share that as well. We join our hearts with Christine, who congratulates her niece Katie and new husband Reagan, married on Friday. We join our hearts with Burr in concern and healing wishes because of swelling in their husband's brain and tests tomorrow in St. Louis. We join our hearts with Jean and Dennis Murphy, who share relief and gratitude that their lost dog has been found. We join our hearts with Robin, who shares gratitude for her mother's 69th birthday yesterday, and sorrow for the death of her husband's grandmother at the age of 94, the last grandparent that either had. Let us join our hearts as we do each week with gratitude and solidarity for all those who protest and witness the systemic injustices in our country and stand up for the preciousness of Black lives. Let us join our hearts as we do each week in concern and care for all those affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, all those who are ill, all those who have died, all those who are mourning loved ones, all those who are deeply worried for loved ones, all of us whose lives are impacted in so many ways, all those who are particularly impacted by the failures of leadership at systemic and institutional levels. We join our hearts with with Kira, who continues to ponder what is best for his brother back in the hospital and attempting to get meds adjusted. These things and so many more prayers and yearnings and joys and sorrows that are not spoken aloud, but that are held between us and among us, even across the distance. Let us hold them in the love that sustains us. And I'm going to invite you now to join in singing as we conclude in the spirit of prayer. Our next hymn is number 389, Gathered Here, and Jeremy and Hans will lead us as we join our voices together from home.
All right, we will sing this one 3 times through, so feel free to join in as a round as we go.
As some of you may know, my work is in education research. So today I'm pleased to have the opportunity to share some of the connections between my research and my personal theology in the area of truth. The two readings today are both from education research journals. Our first reading is an excerpt by Alan Miller from the journal Social Education, published in 2016. Miller's article is entitled, "Confronting Confirmation Bias, Giving Truth a Fighting Chance in the Information Age." We increasingly tend to see our news through prisms of red and blue, to seek confirmation of our existing beliefs rather than information that might contradict or complicate them. We often gravitate to sources aligned with our own biases and partisan leanings, and we are served a steady diet of reinforcing information and images by algorithms that shape and filter what we discover through online searches and social media. This is especially important since research shows that when faced with information that contradicts our beliefs, the thinking portion of our brain, our capacity to reason, tends to shut down, and our emotional defenses kick in. Facts, in theory, should prompt us to change, or at least reassess our views. Instead, facts often cause us to grasp ever more tightly to our erroneous beliefs or misconceptions. Moreover, those with more education and those with higher levels of political knowledge are actually more prone to engage in this behavior than those with less education. The first step in countering the natural tendency to confirm our biases is to recognize it, to teach people how our biases affect the way we seek, accept, share, and act on information. This so-called confirmation bias prompts people to believe assertions they agree with more readily and less critically, even when those claims are provably false. Conversely, disconfirmation bias is the tendency to disregard assertions that challenge one's beliefs, even when they are demonstrably true, or to simply dismiss them as the result of media bias. If you specifically train people to recognize these biases, and they have a mental checklist of what to watch out for, they can overcome them. I'll share the second reading a bit later in the service, but now I want to invite two of my fellow UU members to share some of their thoughts about truth. How do we perceive truth in this world of fake news, attacks on science, post-truth, and truthiness? And what does truth mean to us in our personal theology? First, we will hear from James Gordon, followed by Izy Amuedo.
Thank you, Sam. I'm coming through okay? Great. And let me start by saying how happy I am to be part of a church that makes space during worship to discuss confirmation bias and news literacy. As a journalist and journalism educator, this is certainly my idea of what a sacred space looks like. We are intellectual, emotional, and moral beings, and as such, I believe we are each called to grapple with the cognitive biases, unchecked assumptions, and other blind spots that drive our behavior and constrain our powers of perception. I believe this calling is particularly urgent for those of us in positions of privilege who so often and so unfairly end up setting the agenda for our society. I also believe that we can't do this work alone. So when we talk about being better news consumers, we should be mindful of how much onus we're putting on the individual to solve problems that are deeply rooted into the systems in which we are all entangled. We've seen already how purely consumer-oriented approaches often fall short when facing these sprawling and intractable problems that affect all of us, climate change being the most paramount. Misinformation and disinformation both exploit vulnerabilities in our society, but only if those conditions already exist in our society. Thus, as with infectious diseases, we need a coordinated effort to build immunity, something like a pervasive early childhood vaccine schedule. This sort of collective defense mechanism would probably look a lot like a truly equal public school system, one more focused on fostering critical thinking skills and fostering civic engagement, and less focused on preparing new entrants into the current labor market. But here's the flip side to the coin, where I often find myself dwelling in the last 4 years or so. The ways in which we make news and even define what news is, that's all also entangled in these larger systems. These processes aren't just informed by our culture, they actually play a significant role in forming our culture. So here too, we need to examine how broader cultural biases can subvert our truth seeking. Yes, I'm saying the media is inherently biased, but that's not the same thing as saying that all news is fake, nor is it a prelude to an exercise in pinpointing where each news outlet sits on a partisan spectrum somewhere between MSNBC on the left and Fox News on the right. I'm talking rather about the implicit biases that are deeply ingrained into the norms and conventions of journalism practice, how we select, report, and frame stories that we tell, and how we conceptualize the public sphere and our relationship to it. Take, for instance, our tendency to remain impartial, to withhold our own direct analysis of the facts for fear that we might be labeled as an activist rather than a journalist. This ostensibly democratic principle is easily co-opted by propagandists, conspiracy theorists, and other bad faith actors. The most famous and cynical example that comes to my mind is Fox News, which likes to wrap its political coverage in the slogan, "We report, you decide." Here's another example of bias in the media, and this one is also so obvious that it's easy to miss. It's right there in the name of our flagship product, the news. We are biased toward novelty, and so the sort of crisis that builds slowly and consistently over time, again, climate change, so often flies below our radar. It's not totally hopeless, though, and I have a practical example I want to hold up. The journalist John Sutter recently launched a project called Baseline 2020. He and his team have picked 4 locations around the world that are particularly vulnerable to climate change: Alaska, Utah, Puerto Rico, and the Marshall Islands. And they have committed themselves to visiting every 5 years until the year 2050, documenting the changes facing the people who live there. I have no idea if such a project will succeed in getting the public to connect with the story of climate change, but I see a lot of hope in that strategy of looking beyond the margins of our own immediate experiences, where the limits of one's powers of perception can meet the limits of another person's power of perception, that's where we can begin to connect with our ancestors and our successors and with people who are at the edges of our own cultures. I believe that's how we begin to grapple with these bigger, more urgent truths. In closing, I want to offer up a new metaphor for truth, one that tries to break away from the rhetoric and ideas we've inherited from the Age of Enlightenment, which occurred in Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. That's where we get this metaphor that's so pervasive, this idea of the truth as light shining in the darkness. The metaphor I want to hold up is truth like the edge of a cloud. And I think I came on this because so often lately when I'm outside, I like to look to the sky and watch the edges of clouds. And I love how, as I do that, you begin to see the details, the slow moving and subtle changes, and how the closer you look, the deeper the detail becomes. I also love how in the evening and in the morning, these edges of the clouds can refract the light and basically color the sky. And so I think if we're looking for some sort of imagery to replace what we've had before, this is one that I want to hold up. So thank you.
Good morning. I want to thank Sam really quick for inviting me to reflect on this. I had a lot of fun. I hope everyone can see me okay. I look really blurry to myself, but bear with me. Thanks. The legendary author, Ursula K. Le Guin, wrote in her novel, The Left Hand of Darkness, "Truth is the matter of the imagination." In my dark early morning and late night grievings these days, truth has essentially come down to how do I reduce harm and maximize pleasure. I would like to say that in those moments of suffering, I am motivated by the call to do and seek capital J justice, but I am not. The truth is what allows me to sleep and what gets me out of bed and set to work is at the very least not leaving a me-sized hole in the hearts of those that I love the most and those that love me. But at my most hopeful, it is the hope for more ecstatic experiences in nature and with the ones that I love. Humans, in my observation, crave to see and to be seen. Without that, we cannot have context or connection to ourselves or to any other truths. Humans will construct truth around them that affirms their own worth and their own sense of purpose, regardless of any truth, or capital T truth. That's how we continue to function. Truth and justice, or as I like to say, will to live at times, are inseparable in the way you believe. In that way, if you believe continuing to live is foundational for human justice. A British author and philosopher, John Gray, says that modern humanism is the faith that through science, humankind can know the truth and so be free. But if Darwin's theory of natural selection is true, this is impossible. The human mind serves evolutionary success, not truth. I used to feel the need to serve some sort of universal truth, but in these times, living to be heartened for and anything is plenty. In that way, John Gray's quote resonates with me. I wasn't raised to believe that there is an unquestionable truth. Truths are infinite. There are infinite truths. The truths I can act on in each moment are what matters to me most in these dark days. That does not negate the others, but bowing to understand and acknowledge my limited capacity is necessary for my survival. Living a life responsive to truth as I understand it in each moment is making decisions in my life that reduce harm, lessen human and ecological pain, and create conditions for pleasure and joy. Does that mean ignoring injustices and refusing to do what I can to correct them? No, absolutely not. I grieve and I'm often frustrated by my limitations. Though the only way I can respond to injustice and be accountable to anything or anyone is when I am seeking pleasure and joy. Because when I do not, my internal landscape is a breeding ground for resentful, despondent, arguably sadistic nihilism. There's an efficacy in my actions to be and promote love. In other words, how do I live in the world with chronic, debilitating depression? In this way, truth serves my own evolution as a human, truth that I am consciously sensitive and attuned to some number of things and blind to infinite others. Truth that I am vulnerable to the systems that created me and vulnerable to my own and surrounding cultural misperceptions. Terence McKenna, psychedelic explorer, sometimes referred to as the mushroom ambassador, said, "Culture is the effort to hold back the mystery and replace it with mythology." I cling to many mythologies to make sense of the chaotic mystery of which I am but a flicker. I cling to the magic of Tolkien, the 9 members of the Fellowship of the Ring, and the truth within the strength of their bonds to fight Sauron's death cult, together and apart. Each of them had to face their own limitations and find their own way as the truth of their individual and Middle-earth's realities unfolded before them. I know my loved and beloved ones will understand me and perceive the truth of me and everything else in ways I will never understand myself, as we witness and participate in each other's life stories. As the truth within the story of the Lord of the Rings could not be gestured at or understood without each of the perspectives of the 9. I rejoice in that. Through sitting down and taking an afternoon to ponder truth on paper, I affirm the little I know for certain, and I take comfort in that. Defending an idea of an absolute truth would be exhausting and disorienting and demotivating for me. We cannot, as individuals, encapsulate and understand the truth. Truth is a human need and must be found alone, but alone together. I'll leave you close to where I began with Ursula Le Guin. Distrust everything I say. I'm telling the truth. Thank you.
Thank you both, James and Izzy. And as we reflect on what they've shared, we have a hymn, number 293, which is O Star of Truth. For the second reading today, I will share some remarks and ideas from Guershon Harel and Larry Souder, researchers in mathematics education. This work was published in the journal Issues in Mathematics Education, and they are writing about the issue of students in school attempting to learn about mathematical justification and mathematical proof. Proving claims to be true beyond a doubt is an important part of mathematics, but it is something that is notoriously difficult for students to learn and for teachers to teach. Here are a few thoughts from Harel and Souder. A major reason that students have serious difficulties understanding, appreciating, and producing proofs is that we, their teachers, take for granted what constitutes evidence in their eyes. Rather than gradually refining students' conception of what constitutes evidence and justification in mathematics, we impose on them proof methods and implication rules that in many cases are utterly extraneous to what convinces them. We have demanded that proofs be written in a two-column format. We present proofs of well-stated and in many cases obvious propositions, rather than ask for explorations and conjectures. As a consequence, students do not learn that proofs are first and foremost convincing arguments, that proofs are a product of human activity in which they can and should participate. The goal, instead, should be to help students refine their own conception of what constitutes justification, from a conception that is largely dominated by surface perception, symbol manipulation, and proof rituals, to a conception that is based on intuition, internal conviction, and necessity. Here ends the excerpt, but I would also like to add that in their research, Harel and Souder distinguished between three different foundations of conviction. How do we become convinced of truth? And how do we try to convince other people? They laid out three different possibilities for establishing conviction. One, external sources of conviction. This is when you believe something to be true because it comes from an authority figure, or when something seems to be quite formal and have the trappings of respectability, and so it must be true. When our conviction is based on external factors like these, we do not actually have to deal with the internal logic or validity of the claims themselves. Number two, empirical sources of conviction. This is when you believe something to be true because it appears to be true based on our perceptions, or our common sense understanding, or it has worked out before in specific situations. In math, empirical conviction often comes from checking a few examples, and if those examples work out, then the claim is probably true. In life, empirical conviction could come from anecdotal evidence, or from someone feeling that it's true about them, so it's probably also true for other people. The third type is analytic sources of conviction. This is when you come to believe something because you have thought it through very carefully, its assumptions and implications, and you have inspected the claim with logic and a critical eye. Only after a claim has stood up to this scrutiny, after you've removed all doubt, has it earned your conviction. Hurrell and Souter in their research acknowledge that all three sources of conviction have a place in learning: external conviction, empirical conviction, and analytic conviction. They are all a part of any person's quest for truth. But they also acknowledge that analytic conviction is rare, and so analytic conviction must be pursued very purposefully in mathematics education. So for my reflection on truth, I wanted to say that I enjoy exploring, developing, and refining my personal theology by intersecting it with other aspects of my life. Some people may just receive a theology from an institutional religion, and then they try to apply that theology to different parts of their lives. Or maybe they don't even really apply it, but just hold it as a belief and keep their religion separate from their daily life and work. For me, I draw lots of different sources for my personal theology, and it's a back and forth process between religion, work, family, hobbies, and more. Each informs the other, and to make sense of deep ideas, it has to cut across all of them. So with regard to truth, I want to share a few thoughts that come from my work and a few thoughts that come from my personal life. As I mentioned before, my work is mathematics education. Some of my research has focused on the opportunities that middle school and high school students have to engage in reasoning, argumentation, and proving. Like Hurrell and Souter from the previous reading, I think that it's very important for students to be able to make claims and conjectures, to try to investigate whether they're true or false, try to explain why they're true or false, offer and respond to critiques, and eventually arrive at a pretty rock-solid justification for those claims and conjectures. These things can happen in math class, but they also have the potential to be a good learning experience for debate and argumentation in life, to become comfortable in seeking out truth and debating it productively with other people. The problem is that most math classes, in the United States anyway, do not really engage students actively in this reasoning and proving process. In US math classes, proof is very much a top-down, prescriptive sort of endeavor. Teachers and textbooks dictate to students exactly what they're supposed to prove and how they're supposed to prove it. There's very little freedom or debate for the students. And instead of having productive critiques and refinements, the only critiques that happen are usually just a teacher telling the students all the technical little mistakes that they made. In the US, we have even devised a very particular way that we want students to write down proofs, the two-column proof with statements on the left and justifications on the right. You may remember two-column proofs, but probably not fondly. Two-column proofs make the whole process sort of a cookie-cutter affair, rather than a dynamic investigation of how we come to know that our claims hold water. This prescriptive and narrow way of teaching mathematical proof has implications for how we become convinced. It tends to feed into the external basis of conviction. We are basically training students to give in to an authority figure. Proofs are proofs and theorems are theorems because the teacher or the textbook say so. Luckily, in schools, teachers are a pretty benevolent authority. They're trustworthy in most cases. But other authority figures are not always so benevolent, as we also know very well here in the United States. I don't want students to base their convictions on an external authority. I'd rather have them draw upon their empirical information, their perceptions and experiences, to make sense of what is true. And ideally, that's done in a combination with an analytic mindset as well. Their experiences, together with a critical perspective and the opportunities to debate and clarify things with supportive peers, would be preferable to that external authoritative framework. And this is what I've wanted for myself too. I don't like to accept things as true just because someone says so. I like to comprehend the truth and the meaning for myself. This is a part of my personal theology when it comes to truth. And I'm actually trying to pursue a new research project that would seek to examine different possible connections between math reasoning and a general mindset outside of math. What if, instead of teaching rigid procedures in math, we taught students to always ask two probing questions? How do we know this is true? And is there any way we could possibly be wrong? These questions can actually be a great way to build up new mathematical knowledge as a classroom community. But they're also pretty powerful questions with regard to seeking truth in regular life. How do I know this is true? And is there any way I could possibly be wrong? I'm working with some colleagues in social studies education to try to launch a study where we would look to see if we can bridge math reasoning and civics reasoning using those sorts of critical questions. I would also hope that teaching with those sorts of questions might move students away from the reliance on external authority and build more of a collective pursuit of truth. And maybe it could be part of this sort of inoculation that James was talking about with young children. But I'm facing a little bit of a dilemma. There's a dilemma that I'm grappling with when it comes to authority and truth. As I said earlier, I tend to shy away from a reliance on authority as the designator of truth. And as Reverend Dawson said last week, things aren't true just because they're in an authoritative book. And I certainly don't want other people to believe things just because their authoritative president said so, or because it came from a website or a graphic that looks legitimate. But on the other hand, I don't want all trust in authorities and institutions to crumble. I don't think attacks on science are beneficial. Indeed, we're seeing right now that the undermining of medical and scientific authority has very deadly consequences. And yet many of these anti-science, the highly educated won't tell me what to do people probably sound very much like me. They also say that you shouldn't just believe something because an authority figure says so. You should figure things out for yourself and make your own decisions. In making independent decisions, however, many people make very dangerous and ignorant decisions. It would have been better if they actually had just listened to an authority. It just needs to be the right authority. So then, of course, this dilemma leads me to this question of how do we discern the right authority? Maybe that's where we can use the empirical and analytic reasoning. Even if we can't and we don't have time to use empiricism and analysis to determine the truth of everything, and maybe that truth doesn't even exist based on empiricism and analytics, maybe we can at least use those to try to identify the authorities that are worth trusting. Anyway, that's still a dilemma, and those are some connections between my professional work and my theology on truth. I also want to share some quick thoughts from my personal life as well. I think personally I've moved through two broad phases of seeking truth. My first phase featured me grappling with my worldview and my beliefs about religion. I focused a lot on evidence, and I was guided by the Sagan standard, which is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. This idea was actually expressed well before Carl Sagan by the mathematician Laplace. For me, as I looked at the evidence in phase one of my journey, the evidence seemed to point much more to the idea that supernatural religions were cultural constructions. And the extraordinary claims about omnipotent gods, I didn't want to take those just on faith or a lack of evidence. They didn't seem to have that required level of extraordinary evidence for extraordinary claims. My second phase, which is still ongoing, is much more about learning the truth of myself. A lot of my focus in this phase is on understanding the biases and the enculturations that have stealthily become a part of me. And this connects to the first reading this morning, which talked about confirmation bias. I have come to notice how strong a force confirmation bias is. It's so easy and so dangerously fulfilling to seek out and soak up things that confirm what we already wanted to believe in the first place. And there's also the disconfirmation bias. It feels good and sometimes so high and mighty to disregard things that support an opposing viewpoint. In phase one, I was guided by the idea that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Now in phase two, my mantra is something like, if this evidence supports something that I already wanted to be true, then I have to be extra cautious about accepting it as the truth. How do I know this is true? Could I possibly be wrong? One of the ways I could possibly or could definitely be wrong is because of confirmation bias. And my wife Chelsea can attest that we often ask each other whether there's a chance we could be on the wrong side of an issue, whether it's a parenting decision or a way of handling some conflict at work or our stance on a political issue. We have started to practice stepping out and looking at things in a new way. Is there a chance we could be wrong? Phase two not only involves facing my own biases, but also how I deal with and interact with people who have other biases. Perhaps you can relate to the situation of having your own confirmation biases over the years, which has led you to see current events in a certain way. But maybe somebody else in your family, or maybe a coworker, has had a different set of confirmation biases, leading them to see the current events in a very different way. How do you bridge that massive gap where you're seeing current events very differently? I've been looking into this, and all of the research shows that what doesn't work is simply trying to hit them with facts and figures. Unfortunately, mathematical proofs don't work in political debates. But what can work is to respectfully ask them what their opinion is based on, and to ask them what gray area or what wiggle room they have. They have to be the one to open up their own space for compromise or shared understanding. You can't force it on them. And here's the kicker. Even asking those sorts of respectful questions really only works if you already have some level of trust between you and the other person. There has to be a foundational relationship if you are going to have a chance of arriving at truth and understanding together. And maybe I'm wondering that that's the ultimate truth, that truth is about relationships, not about perspectives or subjectivity or objectivity or what you can prove analytically. Truth as relationship. Maybe that has to be my phase 3. All right, so thank you for allowing all of us the opportunity to share some of our thoughts. And now we want to move in our service to the time when we join in the spiritual practice of generosity, guiding our hearts away from the fear and scarcity all around us, and remembering that it is by sharing and supporting one another that we feel most human. There will be a link in the chat for offerings, and Hans or Jeremy, I believe, will be sharing some offertory music. Our closing words are by the poet Eliza Walcott. The lamp of truth is lighted to guide our doubtful way, and we are now invited to wait the sun's bright ray. And now please join in singing our benediction.
Let us share our benediction.
Thank you so much to everybody for helping with this service. Thank you so much for being here. If you'd like to hang around and have more interactions, we have a coffee hour and the meeting ID is there. And I believe there will be a link, a Zoom link in the chat. So I will pop over there in a moment, but thank you so much and have a great rest of the day.